The summer heat beat down on Frank Wilson's back as he chipped away at the cracked concrete of his driveway. Sweat dripped from his forehead, leaving dark spots on the gray surface below. At 43, Frank wasn't as young as he used to be, and his body reminded him of this fact with every swing of the sledgehammer. Should have hired someone, he muttered to himself, pausing to wipe his brow with the back of his arm. But deep down, Frank took pride in fixing things himself. He'd bought this house in the suburbs of Portland 3 years ago, and bit by bit, he'd been making it truly his own. The driveway was the last major eyesore, a patchwork of cracks that had worsened after last winter's freeze. His wife, Beth, had joked that their car needed shock absorbers just to pull in from the street. Frank took a long swig from his water bottle and surveyed his progress. He'd managed to break up about a quarter of the old concrete, creating a pile of jagged chunks that he'd need to haul away before pouring the new surface. It was going to be a long weekend. As he raised the sledgehammer again, something caught his eye. The cracks in one section of the driveway formed an unusual pattern, almost rectangular with surprisingly straight edges. Frank frowned. In his 15 years as a contractor, he'd seen all kinds of foundation issues, but this was different. "That's weird," he said aloud, though only his golden retriever, Cooper, was there to hear. The dog lifted his head from where he lay in the shade of a maple tree, then promptly went back to napping. Frank set down his tools and crouched to get a better look. He ran his fingers along one of the straight cracks. It wasn't random damage from freezing and thawing. It almost looked deliberate. Curiosity piqued, Frank decided to focus on this section. He positioned the tip of his pry bar along the edge of the rectangle and pushed down. The concrete resisted at first, then gave way with a satisfying crack. Piece by piece, he removed the broken concrete from the area, revealing something that definitely shouldn't have been there. A metal surface. What in the world? Frank's heart beat a little faster as he cleared away more concrete. Within 20 minutes, he had uncovered what appeared to be a metal hatch, roughly 3 feet by 4 feet, embedded in the ground beneath his driveway. The hatch was made of weathered steel, painted an army green that had faded and rusted over what looked like many decades. Most curious of all was the heavy-duty padlock securing the hatch, corroded almost beyond recognition, but still intact. Frank sat back on his heels, mind racing. The house had been built in 1962, during the height of the Cold War. He'd heard stories about people building bomb shelters back then, but nothing in the disclosure paperwork had mentioned anything like this. "Beth," he called out. "Beth, you've got to come see this." His wife appeared at the front door, wiping her hands on a dish towel. At 41, Beth had the same spark in her eyes that had drawn Frank to her when they'd met at a friend's barbecue 12 years ago. "What is it?" she asked, squinting in the sunlight. "Please tell me you didn't hit a water main." "No, nothing like that, just come look." Beth made her way down the front steps and across the lawn, her curiosity visibly growing as she approached. "Is that?" she began, staring at the uncovered hatch. "Looks like some kind of bunker or cellar," Frank said. "It wasn't in any of the house plans." Beth knelt beside him, careful to avoid the sharp edges of broken concrete. "Do you think the previous owners knew about it?" "Old Mr. Harper lived here for almost 50 years before we bought the place. He must have known. But why wouldn't he mention it?" They both stared at the mysterious hatch, the questions multiplying by the second. Who had built it? What was inside? And why had someone gone to the trouble of concealing it beneath a layer of concrete? "Should we open it?" Beth asked, though her tone suggested caution. Frank examined the padlock. "This thing's been here a long time. Probably nothing inside but spiders and old junk. Or maybe it's where Mr. Harper hid all his treasure," Beth joked. But her laugh sounded nervous. Frank stood up and dusted off his hands. "Only one way to find out. I'm going to grab some tools from the garage." While Beth stayed behind, keeping a curious Cooper from investigating too closely, Frank rummaged through his toolbox. He returned with bolt cutters, a crowbar, and a heavy-duty flashlight. "Stand back," he warned, positioning the bolt cutters around the shackle of the old padlock. It took all of his strength to squeeze the handles together. For a moment he thought the lock might be too stubborn, but then came a satisfying snap as the metal finally gave way. The broken padlock fell to the ground with a dull thud. Frank and Beth exchanged a glance, part excitement, part apprehension. "Moment of truth," Frank said, sliding the crowbar under the edge of the hatch. He pushed down, using his body weight as leverage. At first, nothing happened. The hatch seemed fused shut by time and rust. Frank repositioned the crowbar and tried again, grunting with effort. This time there was movement, accompanied by a screech of metal that made both of them wince. "Neighbors are going to think we're being murdered," Beth muttered. With one final heave, the hatch broke free from decades of stillness and swung upward. A rush of stale, cool air escaped from the opening, carrying a musty smell that reminded Frank of his grandfather's basement. Cooper barked once, clearly unsettled by the strange odor. Beth took a step back, wrinkling her nose. "That's interesting," she said diplomatically. Frank pointed his flashlight into the darkness below. The beam revealed a set of metal rungs attached to the side of a concrete shaft that descended about 8 feet, before opening into what appeared to be a small room. "It's a fallout shelter," Frank said, unable to keep the awe from his voice. "A real Cold War bunker right under our driveway." Beth peered over his shoulder. "Can you see anything down there?" Frank adjusted the flashlight, sweeping the beam across what was visible of the room below. "Looks like shelves. Some kind of containers. Can't make out much else from here." "You're not thinking of going down there, are you?" Beth asked, though she already knew the answer. Frank grinned. "Come on, aren't you curious? This is like finding buried treasure." "Buried treasure doesn't usually smell like that," Beth pointed out. "And what if there's bad air down there? Or the structure isn't sound anymore?" Frank had to admit she had a point. "Okay, how about this? I'll just take a quick look. I'll keep the hatch open and you stay up here. If anything seems off, I'll come right back up." Beth didn't look entirely convinced, but she nodded reluctantly. 5 minutes. And keep talking to me the whole time so I know you're okay." "Yes, ma'am," Frank said with a mock salute. He handed her his phone. "Take some pictures while I'm down there. The guys at work are never going to believe this." Before descending, Frank tested each rung of the ladder, making sure it would hold his weight. The metal was rusty but seemed solid enough. With a deep breath, he began to climb down, the beam of his flashlight leading the way. "The ladder seems pretty sturdy," he called up to Beth. "Someone built this thing to last." As he reached the bottom, Frank turned in a slow circle, taking in his surroundings. The bunker was smaller than he'd expected, maybe 10 feet by 12 feet, with concrete walls and a low ceiling. Metal shelving units lined 3 of the walls, stocked with dusty supplies. "It's definitely a fallout shelter," he reported to Beth. "There are cans of food down here, water containers, some kind of radio equipment. All looks ancient. Can you see any dates?" Beth called down. Frank moved closer to examine one of the canned goods. "This one says 1961. These supplies have been down here for over 60 years. As his flashlight beam swept across the room, something caught his attention. A metal filing cabinet in the corner. Unlike everything else in the bunker, this cabinet had a newer padlock securing it. "There's a locked cabinet down here," Frank said, his curiosity intensifying. "Looks like someone's been down here more recently." "Frank, your 5 minutes are almost up," Beth reminded him. "Maybe we should call someone before we go poking around anymore. What if this wasn't actually part of our property?" Frank was barely listening. He had noticed something else. A small desk with papers spread across it, held down by what appeared to be a glass paperweight. As he moved closer, he realized it wasn't a paperweight at all. It was a human skull. Frank's blood turned to ice. He backed away, nearly tripping over a supply crate. "Frank? What's wrong?" Beth called, hearing his sudden movement. His mouth had gone dry. "Beth," he managed to say, his voice hoarse. "Get my phone ready. I need to call 911 right now." "What? Why, what's down there?" The alarm in her voice was rising. Frank was already climbing back up the ladder, taking the rungs 2 at a time, his heart hammering in his chest. "There's a skull, Beth. A human skull. And I don't think it's been here since the 60s. Frank scrambled out of the hatch, his face pale and his hands trembling. Beth stood there, clutching his phone, eyes wide with concern and confusion. "What do you mean, a skull?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like a Halloween decoration or something?" Frank shook his head, gulping in the fresh air. "No, God, no. It's real. It's sitting on a desk down there like some kind of sick paperweight." Beth's hand flew to her mouth. "Are you absolutely sure? I've worked construction sites where we've had to stop because of remains." Frank's voice was tight. "I know what human bones look like." Without another word, Beth handed him his phone. Frank dialed 911, his thumb slipping on the screen. As he waited for the call to connect, he glanced at the open hatch. The dark hole in his driveway suddenly seemed sinister. as if it might swallow their peaceful suburban life. "1, what's your emergency?" The dispatcher's calm voice came through the speaker. I found something under my driveway," Frank began, struggling to keep his voice steady. "There's a fallout shelter or bunker of some kind, and inside there's a human skull." He gave their address and answered the dispatcher's questions as best he could. No, he hadn't touched anything. Yes, the entrance was secure. No, there was no immediate danger. "Officers are on their way," the dispatcher assured him. "Please wait outside your home and don't go back into the bunker." After hanging up, Frank and Beth stood in stunned silence, staring at the open hatch. Cooper sensed their unease and pressed against Frank's leg, whining softly. "Who do you think?" Beth couldn't finish the question. Frank shook his head. "I don't know. But someone's been down there more recently than the 60s. That filing cabinet had a newer lock on it." "Mr. Harper?" Beth suggested. The elderly man had sold them the house 3 years ago and moved to Arizona to live with his daughter. He'd seemed like a typical retiree, a bit grumpy but hardly the type to have human remains hidden on his property. "Maybe," Frank said, though he sounded doubtful. "Or maybe he never knew about it either." The concrete over the hatch looked pretty old. They didn't have time to speculate further. Within minutes, the quiet of their Saturday afternoon was shattered by the wail of sirens. 2 police cruisers pulled up in front of their house, followed closely by an unmarked sedan. Their next-door neighbor, Tom Reynolds, emerged from his garage, curiosity written across his face. Across the street, the blinds twitched in several windows. Frank groaned inwardly. By dinner time, the whole neighborhood would be buzzing with rumors. 4 uniformed officers approached, along with a plainclothes detective who introduced herself as Detective Lisa Chen. She was a compact woman with an air of calm efficiency that Frank found reassuring amid the chaos. "Mr. and Mrs. Wilson?" she asked, and they nodded. "I understand you found something concerning on your property. Can you show me?" Frank led Detective Chen and 2 of the officers to the open hatch, while the other officers began stringing yellow police tape around the perimeter of the driveway. "I was replacing the concrete," Frank explained, pointing to his abandoned tools and the pile of broken chunks. "Found this hatch underneath. It's some kind of old fallout shelter, but He swallowed hard. "There's a skull on a desk inside." Detective Chen peered into the opening, her expression unreadable.
"And you said you just found this today?"
"About an hour ago," Beth confirmed. The hatch was padlocked. Frank had to cut it open. One of the officers produced a camera and began taking photographs of the hatch and surrounding area. Another spoke quietly into his radio, and Frank caught phrases like possible human remains and crime scene unit. "Did either of you go inside?" Detective Chen asked. "Just me," Frank said. "Beth stayed up here." "And you touched nothing besides the lock and the hatch itself?" Frank shook his head. "I just looked around with my flashlight. As soon as I saw the skull, I came straight back up." Detective Chen nodded, making notes in a small notebook. "How long have you owned this property?" 3 years, Beth said. "We bought it from an older man named Arthur Harper. He'd lived here since the 70s, and he never mentioned anything about a shelter under the driveway." "No," Frank said. "Nothing in the disclosure forms either. We had no idea it was there." More vehicles arrived, a crime scene van, a medical examiner's car, and another unmarked police vehicle. Frank and Beth watched as their quiet cul-de-sac transformed into a hub of police activity. A team in white coveralls emerged from the crime scene van. After a brief conversation with Detective Chen, 2 of them prepared to enter the bunker, donning masks and gloves. "Mr. Wilson," Detective Chen said, "would you be willing to describe exactly what you saw down there to these officers? It would help them know what they're looking for." Frank nodded, though the thought of reliving those moments made his stomach churn. He described the layout of the bunker, the shelves of supplies, the filing cabinet, and the desk with its grim decoration. The crime scene technicians listened intently, asking occasional questions about dimensions and positioning. "Good," Detective Chen said when he finished. "Now I'd like you and your wife to wait inside your home. Officer Patel will come with you to take your formal statements." As they were led away, Frank glanced back to see the technicians disappearing one by one down the hatch, carrying cases of equipment and powerful lights. Inside their living room, which felt strangely normal amid the surreal turn of events, Officer Patel, a young man with kind eyes and a precise manner, began taking their statements. He asked them to recount every detail, from the moment Frank noticed the unusual cracks to the discovery of the skull. "Have you had any unusual visitors?" Officer Patel asked. "Anyone asking about the property or previous owner?" Frank and Beth exchanged glances. "No," Beth said. "Nothing like that. What about Mr. Harper? Did he ever behave strangely or say anything that seems significant in hindsight?" Frank tried to remember their interactions with the old man. He was pretty private. Didn't talk much during the sale. His daughter handled most of it. He seemed, I don't know, sad to be leaving maybe, but not suspicious. "Do you have contact information for Mr. Harper or his daughter?" Beth nodded and went to retrieve their file of house documents. As she handed over the information, they heard a commotion outside. Through the front window, they could see more official vehicles arriving, including one with federal government plates. "What's going on?" Frank asked, a fresh wave of unease washing over him. Officer Patel glanced outside and frowned. "I'm not sure. Excuse me for a moment." Left alone, Frank and Beth moved to the window, watching as men and women in various uniforms conferred in clusters on their front lawn. "This is insane," Beth whispered. "What have we stumbled into?" Before Frank could respond, Detective Chen entered the house, accompanied by a tall man in a dark suit, who introduced himself as Agent Russell from the FBI. "FBI?" Frank echoed, his voice cracking slightly. "Why is the FBI involved?" "Standard procedure when we discover certain types of scenes," Agent Russell said smoothly. His voice was deep and measured, betraying no emotion. "We have resources that can help identify remains and determine their age. But it's just a skull, right?" Beth asked.
Is there
"More down there?" Detective Chen and Agent Russell exchanged a glance that made Frank's blood run cold. "We've found additional remains," Detective Chen confirmed, "and some documents that are of interest to federal authorities." "What kind of documents?" Frank asked. "I'm not at liberty to discuss that right now," Agent Russell said, "but I do need to ask you both some additional questions." The questioning that followed was more intensive than before. Had they noticed anyone watching their house? Had they received any strange mail? Did they know anyone with military or government connections? The questions seemed to imply something far more complex than a simple case of hidden remains. As evening approached, the activity outside showed no signs of winding down. Powerful lights had been set up around the hatch, and a steady stream of evidence bags was emerging from the opening. "What happens now?" Frank asked after Agent Russell finally ran out of questions. "We'll need to secure the scene overnight," Detective Chen said. "Officers will remain on your property. I'm afraid you won't be able to use your driveway for some time. Can we stay in our house?" Beth asked, the strain of the day evident in her voice. "Yes, but we may need to ask you to leave temporarily tomorrow while we conduct further investigations," Agent Russell said. "Would you have somewhere you could go?" Frank nodded numbly. They could stay with Beth's sister in Vancouver, just across the river, though explaining this situation would be challenging. As Detective Chen and Agent Russell prepared to leave, a crime scene technician appeared at the door. He whispered something to Agent Russell, whose eyebrows rose slightly, the first real emotion he'd displayed. "Mr. and Mrs. Wilson," Agent Russell said, turning back to them. "There's been a development. We've identified some documents in the bunker with classification markings." "Classification? You mean like secret government stuff?" Frank asked incredulously. "I can't comment on the nature of the documents at this time," Agent Russell replied, "but their presence has elevated this case. I'm going to need you both to come with me to answer some additional questions." Beth's face went pale. "Are we in some kind of trouble?" "No," Detective Chen interjected, shooting a look at Agent Russell. "You're not suspects, but this discovery on your property has raised some significant questions that we need to address immediately." Frank felt as if the floor were tilting beneath him. That morning, his biggest concern had been finishing the driveway before Monday. Now he and Beth were being asked to accompany FBI agents to discuss classified documents found in a secret bunker under their home, a bunker that also contained human remains. "Can we at least pack a bag?" Beth asked, her practical nature asserting itself even in this bizarre situation. Agent Russell nodded. "Of course. Officer Patel will accompany you. Please be quick." As they moved through their home, gathering overnight essentials with an officer shadowing their every move, Frank caught Beth's eye. The question that passed between them needed no words. What in the world had they uncovered beneath their ordinary suburban driveway? And more importantly, whose secrets were buried there? The government building where Frank and Beth were taken was nondescript. A 6-story brick structure that could have housed anything from tax offices to a small community college. The sign out front simply read, Federal Building, offering no hints about the agencies inside. It was nearly 9 p.m. by the time they arrived. Frank's stomach growled, reminding him that they hadn't eaten since lunch. The day had begun so normally. Him working on the driveway, Beth planning to grill chicken for dinner. Now they were being escorted through security checkpoints by stone-faced federal agents. "Can we get something to eat?" Beth asked as they rode an elevator to the 4th floor. "We haven't had dinner." Agent Russell nodded to one of his colleagues. "Agent Torres, would you arrange for some sandwiches and coffee?" His tone was polite but distant, as if they were unexpected house guests rather than people whose lives had just been turned upside down. They were led to a room that tried hard not to look like an interrogation chamber but failed. Despite the comfortable chairs and landscape paintings on the walls, the large mirror on one side gave away its true purpose. Frank had watched enough crime shows to know there were people watching from behind that glass. "Please have a seat," Agent Russell said, gesturing to the chairs on one side of a rectangular table. "I want to assure you again that you're not in any trouble. We just need to understand exactly what happened today and what you know about your property." Frank and Beth sat close together, drawing comfort from each other's presence. Detective Chen joined them, sitting slightly apart from the FBI agents. Frank was glad to see her. Her presence felt like a small anchor of normality in this increasingly strange situation. "Let's start at the beginning," Agent Russell said, placing a digital recorder on the table. "For the record, could you state your full names and how long you've owned the property at 1842 Oakwood Drive?" They went through the basics, their names, occupations when they'd purchased the house, what they knew about the previous owner. Frank described again how he discovered the hatch while replacing the driveway concrete. "And you had no prior knowledge of any underground structure on your property?" This question came from a new agent who had joined them, a woman with short gray hair who had introduced herself as Special Agent Harriet Powell. "None whatsoever," Beth answered firmly. "It wasn't in any of the disclosure forms, and Mr. Harper never mentioned anything like that." "Speaking of Arthur Harper," Agent Russell said, sliding a photograph across the table. "Is this the man who sold you the house?" The photo showed an elderly man with thick white hair and wire-rimmed glasses. Frank and Beth both nodded. "That's him," Frank confirmed. "Though he looked a bit frailer when we knew him," Agent Powell made a note. "Mr. Harper passed away 14 months ago in Arizona. According to his daughter, he lived in your house from 1974 until he sold it to you in 2022. This was news to Frank and Beth. They exchanged a quick glance. "We didn't know he died," Beth said softly. "He seemed nice enough, just ready to retire somewhere warmer." "What about before Mr. Harper?" Frank asked. "Who owned the house before him?" The agents exchanged looks. "That's where things get interesting," Agent Russell said. "The house was built in 1962 by a man named Howard Wells. He lived there until 1973, then sold to Harper and moved to Florida. Wells worked for the Department of Energy from 1958 to 1972. "The Department of Energy?" Frank repeated, confused. "What does that have to do with a skull in our bunker?" Agent Powell leaned forward. "During the Cold War, the Department of Energy, or the Atomic Energy Commission as it was known, then was responsible for nuclear weapons development and testing. Mr. Wells was involved in classified projects. A chill ran through." "Frank, are you saying there's something radioactive under our driveway?" "No," Agent Russell said quickly. "We've already checked for radiation. The bunker is clean, but the documents we found down there are another matter." The door opened and Agent Torres returned with a tray of sandwiches, chips, and coffee. Frank realized how hungry he was and gratefully accepted a turkey sandwich. Beth took a vegetarian option and sipped at the steaming coffee. As they ate, Agent Powell spread several photographs on the table, images taken inside the bunker. Frank recognized the shelves of supplies he'd seen, but now they were brightly lit, revealing more details. Government-issued ration cans, a hand-cranked radio, first aid kits with faded Red Cross symbols, standard Cold War shelter supplies, Agent Powell explained. Thousands of Americans built similar bunkers during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But most didn't have this. She placed another photo on the table. It showed the metal filing cabinet Frank had noticed. now with its padlock cut off and drawers open. Inside were rows of manila folders, each stamped with red lettering, classified. Or this, Agent Russell added, sliding over the final photo. Frank nearly choked on his sandwich. It was a close-up of the desk he'd seen, with the skull clearly visible, but now he could see what lay beneath it. A set of blueprints partially visible, showing what looked like some kind of mechanical device. "What is that?" Beth asked, pointing to the blueprints. "We're still analyzing the documents," Agent Russell said carefully, "but they appear to be technical specifications for a project Wells was working on." Frank set down his sandwich, appetite suddenly gone. "And the remains?" Detective Chen spoke up for the first time in a while. "The medical examiner believes they've been there for decades. Initial assessment suggests the remains belong to an adult male, and there's evidence of a gunshot wound to the skull." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Someone had been killed in that bunker, someone whose body had lain there undiscovered, while families lived their normal lives just feet above. "Do you know who it is?" Beth asked. "We have a theory," Agent Powell said, "but we'll need DNA testing to confirm. Based on personal effects found with the remains and the time period of the documents, we believe it might be Dr. Raymond Fletcher, a physicist who worked with Wells and was reported missing in 1971. Frank's head was spinning.
So you think this Wells guy killed his colleague and hid the body in a bunker under his driveway?
Why? That's what we're trying to determine, Agent Russell said. The classified nature of their work complicates things. These men had access to sensitive information during a tense period in our history. Espionage, Beth suggested, looking stunned at her own question. Agent Powell nodded. It's one possibility. The Cold War was at its height. Soviet intelligence would have paid handsomely for American nuclear secrets. Frank pushed his plate away entirely. This is insane. You're saying we've been living on top of a Cold War murder scene? That our driveway has been hiding some kind of spy story for 50 years? We don't have all the answers yet, Detective Chen said, her voice gentler than the federal agent's. But yes, it appears something along those lines occurred. What happens now? Beth asked, her practical nature asserting itself again. Can we go home? Is our house a crime scene? Agent Russell cleared his throat. That's complicated. The bunker and your driveway are definitely crime scenes and will remain secured. As for the house itself, we'll need to conduct a thorough search. There may be additional evidence inside. What? No, Frank protested. The bunker isn't connected to the house. Whatever happened down there has nothing to do with our home. We don't know that for certain, Agent Powell said firmly. Wells built both the house and the bunker. There could be other hidden areas, other evidence. Frank ran a hand through his hair, frustration mounting. So we're just homeless now? Because some government scientist maybe killed his buddy 50 years ago? Detective Chen intervened. No one's saying you're homeless, Mr. Wilson. We're arranging temporary accommodations for you and your wife. The department has agreements with several hotels for situations like this. Situations like this? Beth repeated incredulously. You often have people discover Cold War murder bunkers under their property? That earned a small smile from Detective Chen. Not specifically, no. But we do occasionally need to provide temporary housing for people displaced by criminal investigations. A knock at the door interrupted them. A young agent entered and whispered something to Agent Russell, who frowned and stood up. Excuse me for a moment, he said, following the younger agent out of the room. In the uncomfortable silence that followed, Frank reached for Beth's hand under the table. She squeezed his fingers tightly. I know this is overwhelming, Agent Powell said, her tone softening slightly, but I want to assure you that we're working as quickly as possible. Our goal is to disturb your lives as little as necessary while conducting a thorough investigation. What about our dog? Beth asked suddenly. Cooper was in the backyard when we left. Animal control was called to the scene, Detective Chen assured her. Your dog has been taken to your sister-in-law's house as you requested. Frank was about to thank her when Agent Russell returned, his expression even more serious than before. We've made another discovery, he announced. The technical teams have identified the documents in the bunker. They're designs for a portable nuclear device, what we'd now call a suitcase nuke. And based on inventory logs we've found, key components for building such a device were missing from Los Alamos National Laboratory in 1971. The room went utterly silent. Frank felt a cold weight settling in his stomach. Are you saying— Beth began, unable to finish the sentence. Agent Russell nodded grimly. We're saying that Howard Wells may have killed Dr. Fletcher over stolen nuclear weapon components. Components that, as far as our records show, were never recovered. Frank stared at him in disbelief. And you think they might be somewhere on our property? In our house? It's a possibility we have to investigate, Agent Powell said. Which is why we need your full cooperation. Starting with anything unusual you might have noticed in your 3 years living there. Hidden spaces, unusual wiring, areas of the house that don't quite make sense architecturally. Frank and Beth looked at each other, the same thought passing between them. Beth nodded slightly and Frank turned back to the agents. There is one thing, he said slowly. In the basement, there's a section of wall that always seemed odd to me. It's covered with wood paneling, but it doesn't match the rest of the room. I always figured the previous owner had done some DIY work and just used whatever materials he had on hand. Agent Russell leaned forward intently. Show me on this floor plan. He pushed a blueprint of their house across the table. Frank pointed to a section of the basement wall. Right here. It's about 8 feet wide. When you knock on it, it sounds different than the surrounding concrete. The atmosphere in the room had changed. The federal agents were suddenly alert, energized. We need to go back to the house, Agent Russell said, standing up. Right now. The convoy of black SUVs and police cars pulled up to Frank and Beth's house just before midnight. The street, normally quiet at this hour, was alive with activity. Neighbors peered from windows and doorways, some still in their pajamas, drawn by the commotion. Frank felt a strange mix of emotions as he stepped out of the vehicle. This was his home, the place where he and Beth had planned to raise a family, to grow old together. Now it felt like something from a spy thriller, surrounded by federal agents and police tape. Their front yard had been transformed into a command center. Portable lights illuminated the driveway where the open hatch gaped like a wound in the concrete. A large tent had been erected over the opening, and people in hazmat suits moved in and out with careful precision. This way, Agent Russell directed, leading them not to the front door, but around to the side of the house, where a cellar entrance provided direct access to the basement. Frank had to duck his head as they descended the narrow stairs. The basement light was already on, and he could see more agents inside, examining the walls with flashlights and what looked like handheld metal detectors. Over here, Frank said, pointing to the section of paneled wall he'd mentioned during questioning. This whole section always seemed off to me. In the harsh light of the basement, the paneling looked even more out of place than he remembered. A cheap 1970s wood veneer that didn't match the rest of the finished basement. It covered an area about 8 feet wide and reached from floor to ceiling. Agent Powell ran her hand along the edge of the paneling. No visible seams or handles, she murmured. No obvious way to open it. A technician approached with what looked like an ultrasound device. We'll do a scan first, he explained. See what's behind there before we start tearing into it. Frank and Beth stood back as the technician ran the device slowly across the paneled wall. A small screen showed shadowy images that meant nothing to Frank, but the technician's expression grew more intense. There's definitely a void behind this wall, he announced, and there appears to be metal objects inside. Agent Russell's posture stiffened. Get the entry team down here, he ordered a nearby agent who immediately spoke into his radio. Within minutes, the basement was crowded with people. Some wore FBI jackets, others hazmat suits with radiation detection equipment. Detective Chen stayed close to Frank and Beth, her presence somehow reassuring amid the controlled chaos. We're going to open this wall, Agent Russell informed them. I need you to wait upstairs with Detective Chen. If we find what we suspect might be behind there, this could become a hazardous material situation. Beth tightened her grip on Frank's arm. What exactly do you think is in our wall? She asked, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Agent Powell answered carefully. Based on the documents found in the bunker, we believe Wells might have hidden components for a tactical nuclear device somewhere on the property. If that's the case, some materials could still be radioactive or chemically unstable after all these years. Frank felt the blood drain from his face. We've been living with that in our house? For 3 years? If it's sealed properly, which it appears to be, there would be minimal risk from simply living near it, the agent assured him. But opening the chamber could change that, which is why we need you upstairs now. Detective Chen guided them back up the narrow stairs. Frank took one last look at the wall that had bothered him since they bought the house. He'd always planned to remove that ugly paneling someday. Now he was grateful he'd never gotten around to it. Upstairs they settled in the living room, which had become another hub of activity. Agents were carefully examining every inch of the house, taking photos, measuring walls, looking behind pictures. "Can I get you anything?" Detective Chen asked. "Water, coffee?" Beth shook her head. "Just answers." "I still can't believe this is happening." Frank sank into his favorite armchair, trying to process everything. "How did we not know? 3 years we've lived here and never suspected a thing." "That was the point," Detective Chen said, sitting across from them. "Wells designed it that way. From what we've pieced together so far, he was a brilliant engineer with high-level security clearance. If he wanted to hide something, he'd know how to do it properly." "But why?" Beth asked, rubbing her temples. "Why steal nuclear components? Why kill his colleague? Was he working for the Russians?" Detective Chen shrugged. "That's what the historical analysts are trying to figure out. They're going through old case files, intelligence reports from the era. The Cold War was a complicated time. They sat in tense silence, broken only by the occasional crackle of radios and the muffled sounds of work going on throughout the house." Frank checked his watch, nearly 1 a.m. Was it really just that morning that he'd been breaking up his driveway? It felt like weeks ago. Suddenly, raised voices came from the basement stairwell. Agent Torres appeared in the living room doorway, his expression tense. "They found something," he said to Detective Chen. "Agent Russell is requesting Mr. Wilson come down." "Just Mr. Wilson," he added when Beth started to stand. Frank looked at his wife, who nodded reluctantly. "Go," she said. "But come right back and tell me everything." The basement was even more crowded now. The paneled wall had been completely removed, revealing a steel door set into the concrete behind it. The door had no handle, just a circular dial like a safe's combination lock. "Mr. Wilson," Agent Russell greeted him grimly. "We need your help." Frank looked at the door in confusion. "I don't know anything about this. I didn't even know it was here." "We understand that," Agent Powell said. "But we found something interesting when we removed the paneling." She pointed to the upper corner of the doorframe, where a series of small numbers had been carved into the concrete. "They look like dates," Frank observed, squinting at the faint markings. Agent Russell nodded. "That's what we think too. The most recent one is from 2022, the year you bought the house." Frank felt a chill run through him. "So someone accessed whatever's behind this door the same year we moved in?" "It appears so," Agent Powell confirmed. "And since Harper was the previous owner, you think he knew about this all along?" Frank's mind raced, trying to reconcile the image of the frail old man who'd sold them the house with someone hiding nuclear secrets. "We believe Harper was the keeper of whatever is behind this door," Agent Russell explained, possibly unwittingly at first. According to his daughter, he bought the house in a hurry back in '74, paid cash, below market value. Wells could have chosen him deliberately, Agent Powell added, a single man with no technical background, unlikely to discover or understand what was hidden here. Frank stared at the door. "But why are the dates carved there? And how does this help us open it?" Agent Russell exchanged glances with his colleagues. "We think the dates are a clue to the combination. A reminder system for Harper or whoever else knew about this place." "Our cryptanalysts are working on it," Agent Powell said. "But since you live here now, we thought you might notice something we're missing." "Any significant dates related to the house? Numbers that Harper might have emphasized during the sale?" Frank racked his brain, trying to remember every interaction with the old man. "The only number I remember him being particular about was the address. He corrected the real estate agent when she got it wrong in some paperwork." "The address?" Agent Powell perked up. "What about it?" "It's 1842 Oakwood Drive." But Harper insisted it was important that the 18 be written as separate digits, not 18. He was weirdly adamant about it. The agents looked at each other with renewed interest. 1842, Agent Russell murmured, moving toward the dial on the steel door. "Let's try it." He turned the dial carefully, right to 1, left to 8, right to 4, left to 2. Nothing happened. "Maybe it's a date," suggested one of the technicians. "January 8th, 42? Agent Russell tried again, this time treating the numbers as a month, day, and year. Again, nothing. Frank frowned, watching them. Something nagged at the back of his mind. "Wait," he said suddenly. "The house number isn't the full address. It's 1842 Oakwood Drive, Apartment B." "This isn't an apartment building," Agent Powell pointed out. looking around the single-family home's basement. I know it's weird, Frank agreed. It's on all the official paperwork, though. Harper told us it used to be a duplex way back but was converted to a single home in the 70s. The B just stayed on the address. Agent Russell's eyes lit up. Let's try 18422, if B is the second letter of the alphabet. This time, when he finished the sequence, there was a distinct click from within the door. A seam appeared around its edge and it swung outward a few inches on silent hinges. The room went completely still. Agent Russell motioned everyone back and gestured to the hazmat team. Your turn. Full precautions. 2 technicians in full protective gear approached the door. One carried a radiation detector, which he held out as the other carefully pulled the door fully open with a tool that looked like a shepherd's crook. Frank held his breath. The detector remained silent. No immediate radiation, the technician confirmed. Proceeding with visual inspection. The 2 hazmat-suited figures disappeared into the dark opening. Long minutes passed as everyone waited in tense silence. Finally, a voice came through on the radio. Chamber is clear. No radioactive materials detected. You're not going to believe what's in here, though. Agent Russell grabbed a flashlight and motioned to Agent Powell. Stay here, he ordered Frank and the others. We'll check it out first. They disappeared into the chamber. Frank shifted from foot to foot, burning with curiosity and dread in equal measure. What could possibly be behind that door that wasn't radioactive but still warranted such caution? 5 minutes later, Agent Russell emerged, his face a mixture of disbelief and, was that amusement? Mr. Wilson, he said, I think you should see this. Just you for now. Frank followed him through the door, which opened into a surprisingly large chamber, at least 15 feet square with a high ceiling. The air was stale but breathable. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he froze in astonishment. The room was filled with money. Stacks and stacks of cash in neat bundles lined metal shelves along one wall. Old-fashioned gold coins filled small wooden chests. Jewelry sparkled in display cases. A collection of rare stamps in protective sleeves filled a cabinet. What? What is this? Frank stammered. If I had to guess, Agent Russell said, I'd say it's the payment Howard Wells received for those missing nuclear components. Soviet intelligence would have paid handsomely for American nuclear secrets during the Cold War. And Harper knew about this? He had access to all this money and still lived like a regular retired guy. Agent Russell shrugged. Maybe he was just the caretaker. Or maybe he skimmed a little now and then. We'll probably never know for sure since he's dead. Frank turned slowly, taking in the fortune hidden within his home's walls. So there aren't any nuclear parts in here? Just treasure? The nuclear components are the real mystery now, Agent Russell said grimly. If they're not here and they've been missing since 1971, he didn't need to finish the thought. Frank understood the implications. Somewhere out there, the parts for a portable nuclear device had been in unknown hands for over 50 years. What happens now? He asked, gesturing at the room of riches. That's complicated, Agent Russell admitted. This is evidence in what's now a historical espionage case. There will be a lot of paperwork, a lot of agencies involved. Frank's head was spinning. And our house? Our lives? I think it's safe to say, Agent Russell said, with the first hint of a genuine smile Frank had seen from him, that things are going to be very different from now on. 3 weeks had passed since that fateful Saturday morning when Frank had discovered the hatch beneath his driveway. 3 weeks that had completely transformed his and Beth's lives. They sat at a conference table in the federal building, surrounded by agents, lawyers, and officials from multiple government agencies. The room buzzed with conversation as they waited for the final briefing to begin. You doing okay? Frank asked Beth quietly, squeezing her hand under the table. She nodded, offering a small smile. Just ready for some closure, and to figure out what normal looks like from here on out. Frank understood exactly what she meant. The past weeks had been a whirlwind of questioning, paperwork, and revelations. They'd spent 10 days in a hotel while their home was thoroughly investigated, then were finally allowed to return under certain conditions. Namely, that they wouldn't discuss the case with anyone and would cooperate with the ongoing investigation. The door opened and Agent Russell entered, followed by a silver-haired man in an expensive suit whom Frank had never seen before. The room immediately fell silent. Good morning, Agent Russell began. I'd like to thank everyone for their hard work on what we're now calling Operation Driveway. This has been a complex historical espionage case with modern implications. And your dedication has been invaluable. He turned to Frank and Beth, especially you two. Your cooperation throughout this process has been exemplary. Not like we had much choice, Frank muttered under his breath, earning a gentle elbow from Beth. I'd like to introduce Deputy Director Lawrence from FBI headquarters, Agent Russell continued, gesturing to the silver-haired man. He's here to oversee the final briefing and resolution of this case. Deputy Director Lawrence took center stage with the confidence of someone used to commanding rooms. First, let me express my gratitude to Mr. and Mrs. Wilson. Discovering a Cold War-era espionage cache isn't how most people plan to spend their weekend. I imagine. There was polite laughter around the table. Frank managed to smile. It felt good to find even a hint of humor in the situation after weeks of tension. I've reviewed the entire case file, Lawrence continued, and I'm here to officially close the active investigation. Here's what we know for certain. He clicked a remote and a photo of a younger Howard Wells appeared on the wall screen. He had a serious face, wire-rimmed glasses, and the clean-cut look of a 1960s government scientist. Howard Wells was recruited by Soviet intelligence sometime in 1970. As a senior engineer at Los Alamos, he had access to designs and components for what was then a new class of tactical nuclear devices. Over the course of approximately 8 months, he smuggled out both plans and actual components. Another click showed a photo of the man they now knew was Dr. Raymond Fletcher. Dr. Fletcher discovered what Wells was doing and confronted him in the bunker beneath the driveway. Based on forensic evidence and recently declassified Soviet intelligence reports we've accessed, we believe Wells killed Fletcher with a government-issued sidearm, then hid his body in the bunker. Frank felt Beth shudder beside him. It was still horrifying to think they'd been living above a murder scene for 3 years. Wells received payment from his Soviet handlers, the treasure you discovered in the basement vault. However, something went wrong with the plan to transfer the nuclear components to Soviet agents. We found communications suggesting Wells got cold feet about that part of the deal, possibly after killing Fletcher. Lawrence clicked to another image, a diagram of what looked like a metal briefcase, with complex internal components. This is what Wells stole, parts for a man-portable nuclear device, or what we'd now call a suitcase nuke. Not a complete weapon, but critical components that would be nearly impossible to manufacture without advanced facilities. And you still don't know where they are? Beth asked the question that had been hanging over the investigation for weeks. Lawrence shook his head. That remains the one unsolved aspect of this case. We've searched every inch of your property and found nothing. We've investigated Wells' other properties, relatives, known associates, nothing. What about Harper? Frank asked. The old man who sold us the house? Arthur Harper remains something of a mystery, Agent Powell chimed in. Based on our interviews with his daughter and our investigation, he seems to have been exactly what he appeared to be, a high school history teacher, who got a surprisingly good deal on a house in 1974. We believe Wells chose him deliberately as someone unlikely to discover the bunker or vault, but Harper knew about the vault, Frank pointed out. He accessed it the year he sold us the house. His date was carved on the doorframe. Lawrence nodded. Our theory is that Wells revealed the vault to Harper before moving to Florida, possibly as a form of insurance or payment for maintaining the secret. Harper appears to have accessed it occasionally over the decades, perhaps taking small amounts of the money and valuables. Not small enough to avoid upgrading to a condo in Arizona, Beth muttered. Indeed, Lawrence agreed with a hint of a smile, but he was careful, lived modestly, never flashed his wealth. And most importantly, he kept the secret until he was dying, Agent Russell added. Based on the timing and what his daughter told us, we believe Harper accessed the vault one last time, just before selling you the house, perhaps taking some final retirement bonus for himself. But he never knew about the bunker or the body? Frank asked. We don't believe so, Lawrence said. The concrete over that hatch was poured in 1971, according to analysis. Harper bought the house in '74. He likely never knew what lay beneath the driveway. Frank sat back, processing it all. So what happens now? To us, to the house, to all that? Treasure in the vault? This was the question they'd been waiting weeks to have answered. Their lives had been on hold, suspended in uncertainty. Lawrence folded his hands on the table. The contents of the vault are technically evidence in an espionage case. However, given the historical nature of the crime and certain statutes of limitations, We've reached a decision. Frank held his breath. Beth's grip on his hand tightened. The cash, gold, and valuables recovered from the vault total approximately $8.7 million in current value. There was a murmur around the table. Frank and Beth had been told the vault contained significant value, but this was the first time they'd heard a specific figure. As the current property owners who discovered and reported this espionage cache, thereby potentially preventing these nuclear components from ever being located and used, you are entitled to a finder's fee. Frank's heart sank a little. A fee sounded like a small percentage. A token amount. The Department of Justice has determined that you will receive 70% of the total recovered assets. Frank blinked, certain he'd misheard. 70% of $8.7 million? Lawrence nodded. Approximately $6.1 million minus applicable taxes. The remainder will be allocated to a victims fund for families affected by Cold War espionage. Beth made a small sound beside him, something between a gasp and a laugh. Frank felt lightheaded. Just like that, they were millionaires. All because he'd decided to fix the driveway himself instead of hiring someone. There are, of course, conditions, Lawrence continued. You'll be required to sign non-disclosure agreements about certain aspects of this case, particularly anything related to the missing nuclear components. Your property will remain subject to periodic inspections, and any renovation work will need prior approval for the next 5 years. That seems fair, Beth managed to say, her voice remarkably steady considering the bombshell that had just been dropped on them. What about the bunker? Frank asked. And the remains? Dr. Fletcher's remains have been positively identified through DNA comparison with his surviving relatives, Agent Powell explained. They will receive a proper burial. The bunker itself will be professionally sealed once the investigation is fully complete, though you'll have the option to fill it in entirely if you prefer. I definitely prefer, Beth said firmly. I don't want that space under our home, regardless of what's done to seal it. The meeting continued for another hour as they went through the details of the agreements they would need to sign and the process for transferring the assets to them. Frank barely absorbed any of it, his mind reeling from the day's revelations. Later, as they stood outside the federal building in the warm afternoon sunshine, reality began to sink in. $6 million, Beth said softly, as if testing how the words felt. What are we going to do with $6 million? Frank put his arm around her shoulders. First, hire someone to finish the driveway. She laughed, a real full laugh that he hadn't heard in weeks. It was the most beautiful sound. And then, she asked, leaning into him. And then, Frank thought about all the possibilities suddenly open to them. Remember that old farmhouse outside Portland we always admired? The one with the apple orchard? Maybe we see if it's for sale. Beth looked up at him, her eyes bright. Run away from all this craziness, you mean? Not running away, Frank corrected her. Moving forward. But maybe to a place with no hatches, no bunkers, and definitely no hidden doors in the basement. I do have one condition, Beth said as they walked toward their car. What's that? When we buy this dream farmhouse, you promise to hire professionals for any renovation work. No more DIY projects that might uncover spy caches or buried treasure or whatever else might be hiding under the floorboards. Frank laughed and pulled her close. Deal. Although, you have to admit, breaking up that driveway turned out to be the most profitable weekend project in history. 6 months later, Frank stood on the porch of their new farmhouse, watching the sunset paint the apple orchard in shades of gold. Beth came out to join him, 2 glasses of wine in hand. The inspector called, she said, handing him a glass. Final approval came through. The house passed every test. No hidden chambers. No secret bunkers, not even a false wall. Just an ordinary, beautiful old farmhouse, Frank said, clinking his glass against hers. With an extraordinary story about how we got here, Beth added. In the distance, their new driveway, professionally installed, curved through the trees. It was smooth, unblemished concrete with no mysterious hatches or buried secrets. Just a simple path leading home. Frank smiled. Sometimes the most remarkable journeys begin with the most ordinary decisions, like fixing a cracked driveway on a sunny Saturday morning.